Hello everyone, my name is Marta Crossley, and today I am going to be talking about deaf culture. I am studying to be a sign language interpreter, so that is why I decided on this topic. Okay, so to begin, when we think of culture, we don't always think of deaf culture. We usually think about culture related to different countries or different ethnicities. So the definition of culture is the customs, art, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. So that's why deaf culture is considered a culture in itself, because it's a group of people who have different social customs and different ways of having different norms that they have. So that is why a lot of other disabilities have culture as well. So people who are in wheelchairs, they usually come together and form a different group, as well as blind people. They all kind of form their own group, but deaf culture is very unique because they have a different language and just a bunch of different norms that I'll get into here soon. Okay. So to begin, I'm going to talk about the difference between deaf culture and hearing culture. So when we first think about it, we don't think there's that big of a difference, but I can assure you that there is. The first time that I went to a deaf social event, I was just floored by just the difference of it all. So to begin, when deaf people are getting someone's attention, it is not at all uncommon for them to point, to wave, to touch you maybe, or anything like that. And in hearing culture, if you're being touched or someone's moving their hands at you, it's very strange, and we all start to kind of look around. But in deaf culture, it's completely normal because they can't hear. So it was one thing that I was very surprised about when I first started learning about deaf culture. I was not at all prepared for someone to point at me, and it kind of makes you feel a little nervous at first, but once you get used to it, it definitely gets better. Another weird thing about, conversation that I'll bring up now is they wave and they point and that kind of stuff, but also when they're having a conversation, and so if you were to see two people signing to one another, the last thing you want to do is walk straight through, but that's exactly what you're supposed to do. So when we see it, we're like, oh my gosh, we're getting in the way of this entire conversation. They won't be able to see what's going on. But really, it doesn't make a difference. It's weirder for you to to sit around and be like, oh, I'm sorry. It's weirder for that. And they look at you like, get out of here. So that was another thing that I had a hard time doing, because especially as Michiganders, we say oops and excuse me whenever we're in someone's way. But deaf people, they just are kind of like, no, now you're really getting in my way more than you would have if you just would have walked straight through. So that's another norm that I was not ready for. And a lot of people don't think of that as something they are supposed to do. One of the biggest differences between hearing and deaf culture is that in hearing culture, we use language that is heard. So here in America, it's English. In Mexico, they speak Spanish. And, all across the world, they're hearing different languages. But in deaf culture, they use sign language. So here in America, they use American Sign Language most often. A fun fact about sign language is that every single country has its own language, its own sign language. So here in America, American Sign Language came from a bunch of different places. So it came from home signs, which before there was a real sign language, people at home had to figure out how to communicate with deaf individuals. So they would make up signs that they used only at home. The only people that they interacted with often would understand. So that's where some of our signs come from. Another place is Martha's Vineyard. On the East Coast, there's Martha's Vineyard. It's an island, and way back in the day, in like the 1800s and stuff, or 1900s, excuse me, it was an entire island, and all they did was use sign language. Even if they were not deaf, they still use sign language, which is a really unique place. It's not the same anymore. That has all moved on, but that's where a lot of signs came from, because it was a full sign language community, and they all communicated that way. And so deaf people, hearing people, they all interacted just as we hearing people think about it today. There was no problem with communication. And then the third place it came from was France. So there was a man named Thomas Gallaudet, and he had a neighbor who was deaf, and he was so intrigued by it, he decided to go to France. And at that time, France, their sign language was more developed than ours was. So he brought back a gentleman named Laurent Claire, and together they started American Sign Language. They just really started pulling everything together. They started a school, all that kind of stuff. And I'll explain more of Thomas Gallaudet in the next couple slides, in the next couple minutes here. But that was something that was huge for deaf people to start getting a language. But sign language is definitely more of a visual language. So when we as hearing people, we sit down and we explain how things sound. So a lot of our words, a lot of our synonyms and stuff like that, we have so many of them because we're trying to express something so it sounds better. We want it to be interesting, and we don't want it to be boring all the time. So we have all these synonyms and stuff like that to make what we're saying more exciting. In sign language, they take what it looks like. So they take a scene or they take a situation and they paint a picture of it in the air. So they use their signs. So there's a lot of and they make a picture of it. So there's a lot of miming, we call them classifiers. So it's just like drawing a picture in space in a sense and using your hands to do that. Because they want to see what it looks like. They don't care what it sounds like if it sounds good. They want to get to the point and see what the whole picture looks like. So it's definitely really cool to see other people's take on what they saw. In addition to the language, there's a lot more eye contact. They have to, like I was saying with the conversation, two people are there looking right at each other and they're having this conversation. As hearing people, I think we've really had a problem with that in the past and even just now of eye contact. We are not used to it, and I see people today, I've become much more accustomed to it, interacting with the deaf community, and I don't have as much of a problem looking at someone and having a conversation. But I noticed my parents, my friends, my siblings, they all, they're either on their phones or they're watching TV, and they just don't make eye contact because they don't need to, in a sense. So we're definitely losing that. So that's one thing deaf people always talk about. They're like, nobody looks at me, and interpreters, that's what they want. They want that eye contact and they want that bond together. So that's something that's kind of an interesting little change. Another thing is that deaf people are very direct, and sometimes it comes across as being rude, but really they're just getting to the point. This is just how they are. They're very blunt, and they're not being rude. They're just being visual. They're just looking at someone and saying, this is what I notice, and this is what it is. And in hearing culture, we're very politically correct. We never want to offend people. If people do offend people, they're rude, or I can't believe they would say that. And in deaf culture, that's how it is. For example, a deaf person might walk in and say, have you gained some weight? And at first, a hearing person might be like, oh my gosh, nobody would ever say that to me. But in deaf culture, it's just what they notice. It's the first thing that they see. It's the first thing that they get from you. And so it's kind of hard to change your perspective on things like that. It's very difficult. But that's one thing that in hearing people, we really start to notice. We sugarcoat a lot. We want to be politically correct. We want to be polite. And deaf people, they just say it like it is. And so hate it, like it, it goes both ways, but that's kind of an interesting little change. The last thing is that as hearing people, we don't realize how much we learn throughout our childhood. So kind of another thing with being rude is a lot of people judge deaf people based on what they say or based on what they do. Like one complaint is that deaf people don't tip like hearing people do. And a lot of that, something could be that they don't want to tip like that, but another thing is they don't have the same incidental learning as we do. So incidental learning is when you walk through a building and you just hear conversations. So when you're at the grocery store, you just hear different things and you learn different things from all these people. So as you can imagine, as children, walking through a school and just learning things, like the funny joke in my town is you learn everything on the bus because kids talk. But as a deaf child, if you're on the bus, you're not learning the same as a hearing child would. So that's something that we all take for granted sometimes. So that's one thing in deaf culture, that sometimes their bluntness could come from just not knowing. So it's really something to think about, and just educate people. Sometimes you have to explain a little bit more to deaf people why this is not polite or why we don't do that. That's something that I have encountered a couple times. Okay, the other thing about deaf culture is, not in regards to hearing culture, but just in itself, is it's a lot like an ethnicity. So it's a lot like its own culture. It's like from a country, but it's like their own little group of people. So what I mean by that is, they have their own language, they have their own art, they have their own separation inside of the culture that they have. So to go in depth about that is, we call it Big D deaf and Little deaf. So Big D deaf is when you define yourself as, I'm deaf. They say, yep, I am deaf. I am proud of that. This is my family. My deaf family is my family, and that is who I am. I am deaf. And Little D deaf is when you're deaf, but you don't classify yourself as deaf. You fit more in a hearing world. So sometimes as deaf people, Big D deaf people, look down on little deaf people because they see little deaf people as not as being proud of who they are. They're not accepting of, having a hearing problem or anything like that. And so that's a separation. So you can be deaf, but not be a part of the deaf culture. So I think that's something to be really important to understand and be aware of, that is possible as well. The other thing, we talked about sign language a little bit, but in sign language, there's a lot of different, it is its own language, and this is something that's just starting to become very well known across the country. Only just in the past few years has deaf or sign language been allowed as a foreign language credit in high schools. So a lot of people see it as a part of English, but in its own world it is not. They have an entire different syntax, so sentence structure. Every sign has its own parameters. So we look at a sign's hand shape, the placement of where it is, the movement that it makes, the palm orientation that it has, and a non-manual signal. So for example, the sign for finally is, so you can see that my hand shape are ones, my placement is at my mouth, the movement is that it flips out, and then the non-manual signal is the p, so on my mouth. So without any of those things, if it was missing any one of those things, it would not mean finally. So that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that you have to have all of that for it to be sign language and for that sign to have that same understanding. Another thing that deaf culture has is artwork. So it's called Devia, and what that is it's just a way for deaf people to express the experiences that they have had. So in the past, deaf individuals have gone through so much oppression. In the past, deaf people were not allowed to sign. They were forced to speak. And so that's something that's, very hard on people. People were very rude to them for having a disability. And so that's something that they're able to express. They're able to express what they went through at school, what they feel like at home, the isolation of it all that they can feel in the hearing world. So to be a Devia artist, you have to be deaf or hard of hearing. As a hearing person, I could not go in and start making this art. And it's mostly just because they want to express their thoughts and their feelings. So I encourage all of you guys to go and look at it. It's beautiful. Most of it, some of it's very heart-wrenching, but other things are just so beautiful. And it really helps you understand and get a different perspective of what deaf individuals have had to go through their entire lives. But the biggest point of Devia is just to show that they're proud of their deafness and they're not disabled, and they want people to understand that. That leads me to my next topic, is that deaf people, they've been through so much oppression, and they understand that they are deaf, they understand that they cannot hear, but they also understand that that does not keep them from being able to do everything that everyone else can. The only thing they can't do is hear. And that's something that is very unique to deafness, I think, because they are able to keep their independence. So no matter what, they still are able to be independent people, to have jobs, to live on their own, to drive, to do all these things that some people who have a disability are not able to do. Blind people, for example, they're not able to drive. They have trouble, walking around and getting around places. It's just some things they have limitations. But as a deaf individual, the only limitation that they have is that they can't hear. But they're still able to get along pretty well by themselves. But I think that a lot of people don't understand that. Especially in Michigan. Here in Michigan, we are an oralism state, which means that sign language is not supported as much as learning how to talk, reading lips, speech therapy. That was pushed so much. And even just like in the past couple of decades has that started to change. But that was what Alexander Graham Bell he really pushed for. And that's one thing people don't understand about Alexander Graham Bell. He really changed the entire world's view on deaf people. And he did not like deaf people, unfortunately. He was married to a deaf woman. But he really made the push for oralism instead of sign language. So that's where a lot of the oppression comes from is, they started to look down on deaf people for that. And so I think because of that, we're kind of having to start all over again. And that's why people who are deaf are really proud of who they are. And they're really trying to overcome everything that they've struggled with in the past. But all of that, there's so much more to deaf culture. But that's kind of like the highlights of it all. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to comment and ask. I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. But other than that, thank you so much for watching. And I hope you learned a little bit more than you knew. Bye.